I found the house online, a cozy, secluded cottage hidden away deep in the woods, exactly the kind of place I wanted for a quiet 2-week vacation away from the city. The rental listing had great reviews, praising the coziness and charm of the old farmhouse and the surrounding woods. The pictures looked perfect. Rustic wooden floors, a fireplace, a small but modern kitchen. It was everything I needed to unwind. When I arrived, the house was just as cozy as I'd imagined. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the front yard. Inside, the rooms were warm and inviting, a tasteful mix of modern comforts and antique charm. Every room but one. At the end of the narrow hallway upstairs was a door that immediately struck me as odd. Unlike the others, it had a heavy brass lock on the outside, as if to keep something in rather than to keep people out. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tried the knob. It turned easily, but the door wouldn't open more than a crack. The lock was latched. I peered through the gap, squinting into the dimness. The room was small and dark. It felt like a space that wasn't meant to be seen, let alone used. The only things inside were 2 chairs. One was an old, worn rocking chair, its wooden slats polished smooth with age, and the other was a modern office chair, black leather with wheels, entirely out of place in a room like this. They sat facing each other in the center of the room as if 2 people had just been having a conversation. Something about the scene made me uncomfortable, but I rationalized this was where the owners kept their things, a space that wasn't meant for guests. I supposed the owners had left the chairs there in storage, but it still seemed strange. Why wasn't there more stored in there? I pulled the door closed again, deciding to leave it alone. The first night in the house was peaceful. The silence of the woods was soothing, and I quickly fell asleep. But the next morning, as I walked past the locked room on my way downstairs, I noticed something unsettling. The door was slightly ajar, the lock hanging loose from its latch. I knew it had been locked. I pushed the door open wider and looked inside. The 2 chairs had moved. The rocking chair was now turned toward the door, as if someone had been sitting in it, watching and waiting for someone else to enter. The office chair was pushed against the far wall, its wheels leaving faint marks on the dusty floorboards. I stood at the door, unsure of what to do. It's funny how, in those moments, the mind desperately wants to find logic, to convince oneself it was nothing. Maybe the lock hadn't been properly secured, and it had slipped off the latch. Maybe I'd imagined where the chairs were before. I closed the door and tried not to think on it. But as the day went on, the feeling of discomfort stayed with me. Every time I passed that door, I found myself looking at it, half expecting it to swing open on its own. That night, I double-checked that the lock was secure before going to bed, and made sure to close the door to the bedroom where I was sleeping. I lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle around me, every creak of the floorboards or whisper of rain making me jump. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke in the morning, I knew something was wrong even before I saw it. The air in the hallway was colder, and the door to the room was wide open. My heart raced as I approached it. The chairs had moved again. The rocking chair was now in the middle of the room, facing the wall where the office chair had been pushed earlier. But the office chair was nowhere to be seen. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The office chair was gone, as if it had never been there. There were no drag marks or footsteps in that dusty room. Panicking, I searched the room, running my hands along the walls, knocking on the floorboards to see if there was a hidden compartment, a trap door, anything that could explain it. but the walls were solid, and there was no sign of the chair. I hurried out, slamming the door behind me, and locked it with shaking hands. I tried to calm myself, to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I had moved the chair myself and forgotten. Maybe I had put it in another room and didn't remember, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety. I avoided the upstairs, tried to keep myself busy in the kitchen and living room, but the thought of that room, those chairs moving on their own, gnawed at me. That night I left every light on in the house, hoping it would drive away the fear that clung to me like a shadow. But the lights only made the empty rooms seem more ominous, their corners darker, more impenetrable. I barely slept, trying to listen for any sounds from the hallway outside. In the morning, I forced myself to check the locked room. The door was closed, the lock in place, and I couldn't bring myself to open it to peek inside. As I stood staring at that lock on that door, I imagined something on the other side, a presence beyond the door, waiting for me to let it out. The thought of those chairs moving on their own, shifting positions in the dead of night, made my skin crawl. I called the owner that day, trying to sound casual as I asked about the room. He was evasive, telling me it was just storage, that it was locked for a reason, and that I shouldn't concern myself with it. But I could hear something in his voice, a hint of nervousness, like he was hiding something. By the 5th day, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time, and every noise in the house set my nerves on edge. I was desperate to leave, but something kept me there, some morbid curiosity or stubbornness. I wanted to know what was happening in that room, even though I was terrified of finding out. That night, the noises started. Faint at first, just the creaking of the floorboards, the sound of something moving in the dark. Then, the unmistakable sound of wheels rolling across wood, back and forth, back and forth. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear as the sound grew louder, closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see what was happening, even if it meant confronting whatever was in that room. I opened my door and stepped out into the hallway, stepping towards the locked room. I found the hallway light and flicked it on, my footsteps creaking along the wooden floor. The door to the room was wide open, the lock hanging from its latch. I let my eyes adjust to the darkness of the room, and my blood ran cold. The rocking chair was in the middle of the room, rocking back and forth on its own, the sound echoing in the silence. The office chair was back, but it was no longer empty. Something was sitting in it, hunched over, its face hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me. The air in the room was heavy, oppressive, and I could barely breathe. The figure slowly turned its head toward me, and I saw its eyes, cold and filled with malice, shining white with the reflection of the hallway light. It smiled, a twisted, unnatural smile that sent a wave of terror through me. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of the rocking chair creaking rhythmically as if it was laughing at me. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the now dark hallway, the door to the room closed and locked as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait until morning. I packed my bags and left the house, driving away as fast as I could. I didn't care about the deposit or the fact that I had another week left in the rental. I just needed to get out. To this day, I don't know what was in that room, or how the chairs moved, but I can still hear the sound of that old wooden rocking chair creaking back and forth in the dead of night. And I know that whatever it was, it's still there, waiting for the next person to come along and unlock that door. The old dairy farm had been abandoned for years, its fields overgrown, the once busy barns now hollow shells. We'd passed it on the way from the airport back to my friend Mark's house when I'd flown in to visit. The sprawling property gave off an eerie, desolate vibe, even in broad daylight. Mark told me the place was supposed to be haunted, and everyone talked about the old owner who had gone missing, abandoning his herd just out of the blue. It was a huge thing back in the day, and locals had all kinds of stories about him and his place, whispers of strange occurrences, of things seen and heard in the night. But we laughed about it, Mark telling me it would make a great haunted house. But when he suggested we explore the barn one night after a few too many beers, I didn't see the harm in it. It would be a fun way to pass the time in a town that seemed to go to sleep at sundown. So we grabbed our flashlights and headed out into the cool night, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The farmhouse loomed in the darkness as we approached, its windows like black, empty eyes staring out at the overgrown yard. The barn was just beyond it, a massive, shadowy structure with peeling red paint and sagging beams. As we stepped inside, the wooden floor creaked underfoot, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. The smell of old hay and mildew was thick in the air, and a sense of anxiety settled over me, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. Mark was joking about how the floors were going to give way, but even his voice seemed too loud in the oppressive silence, like the barn itself was listening. When he started up the stairs, I hesitated, looking around at the shadows that clung to the corners of the barn. The main floor was mostly empty, just a few rotting bales of hay and some old farm equipment covered in rust. The ladder leading up to the hayloft looked sketchy, the wood splintered and worn, but Mark was already climbing it, his steps heavy and sure. Reluctantly, I followed, the rungs rough against my hands as I climbed into the darkness above. The hayloft was even more unsettling than the main floor. The air was colder, the darkness more enveloping. The floor was strewn with broken boards and matted piles of what used to be hay, and the walls were lined with wooden stalls, each with their own latched gate. I wondered what could have been stored up here, without a way to get back downstairs. Maybe chickens or ducks? Mark's flashlight flickered as he moved deeper into the loft, and I caught up to him just as he paused near the far wall, staring at something. I shuffled along behind him, almost afraid of disturbing the stillness. "There's something weird over here," he muttered, pointing his flashlight at the wall. I shone my light in the same direction and saw what had caught his attention. Carved into the wooden boards, in jagged, uneven letters, were the words, "Don't let them out." The letters were deep, the wood splintered around them as if they'd been carved angrily with something sharp, and the sight of them sent a shiver down my spine. It's probably just kids screwing around, right? But I couldn't even force a laugh. Mark didn't respond. He was staring at the wall, but I noticed his flashlight beam wavered slightly. Then slowly he turned to me, his face pale in the dim light. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained to listen, and at first there was nothing, just the crickets chirping outside. But then faintly, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the whisper of fabric brushing against wood, or the quiet scuttling of something small moving in the dark. First I thought it was rats, but even as the idea came to me, I knew it didn't sound right. The noise was steady, too deliberate. It was coming from behind one of the closed stalls. Mark started moving toward the door, and I followed, my heart pounding harder with each step. As we approached, the sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was unmistakably the sound of something or someone scratching at the wood walls beyond the old door. Mark stopped and looked at me with his hand hovering over the wooden door's rusty latch. Then, with a deep breath, he yanked it open. The room was empty, just a dark, narrow space filled with the smell of rotting hay. But the scratching continued, louder now, coming from deeper within the barn. Mark turned, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, revealing the other stalls, each one identical to the last. The scratching was coming from all of them now, a cacophony of desperate, frenzied noises, as if something or many somethings were trying to claw their way out. We started to back away, but before we could even reach the ladder, the noise suddenly stopped. All noise, even the crickets had stopped chirping. The silence was deafening. Even more terrifying than the scratching had been, we froze, staring at the stalls, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, slowly, the doors of the stalls began to creak open, one by one, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. But there was nothing inside. Nothing we could see, at least. But I could feel it. Something cold, something heavy, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The air around us seemed to grow thicker and darker, as if the shadows were closing in, wrapping around us like a strangling blanket. Mark was already scrambling down the ladder, and I was right behind him, almost falling to my death in the process. We ran for the barn doors, our footsteps echoing through the empty space. The scratching had started again, but it was different now, closer, more frantic, as if whatever was inside those stalls had followed us down. We burst out of the barn and into the night, not stopping until we were far beyond the reach of its looming shadow. Only then did we turn back, gasping for breath, our flashlights trembling in our hands. The barn stood silent and still in the moonlight, the doors still swinging from when we ran through them, as if inviting us back inside. But there was something else, something wrong, something that sent a wave of nausea through me as I realized what it was. The ground around the barn, that had been once overgrown with weeds and grass, was now bare, the earth blackened and cracked as if scorched by fire. And there, in the dirt, were footprints, hundreds of them, leading out of the barn and disappearing into the woods, footprints that weren't ours. The rain had been relentless, hammering against the windows. I was sitting in the living room, the TV on for background noise, but I wasn't really paying attention. It was one of those nights where you just wanted to curl up on the couch and watch a movie, but I was restless for some reason. I felt slightly off, tense, like the world had shifted a few degrees from what was normal. I almost didn't hear the knock at the door over the roar of the rain. It was soft, tentative, like someone wasn't sure if they wanted to be heard. I paused, listening intently, but when the knock came again, I almost jumped out of my skin. It wasn't late, but it wasn't a time when I was used to having visitors. And in this weather, it didn't make sense. I got up and opened the door, but there was no one there. Just a small, unassuming box sitting on the doorstep, getting drenched in the downpour. The street was empty, the rain swallowing up any sounds. My first thought was that it might be a package I'd forgotten I'd ordered, but I wasn't expecting anything. I looked around, hoping to catch sight of whoever had left it, but the street was deserted. The box was small, about half the size of a shoebox, wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address, no markings of any kind, just my name, scrawled across the top in thick black ink. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, like whoever had written it was in a hurry or under some duress. I picked it up, the soggy paper squishing under my fingers. It was surprisingly light, almost as if there was nothing inside. I brought it in and set it on the kitchen table. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for a knife to cut the string holding the paper in place. As I peeled back the wet paper, a sense of unease grew stronger. As I peeled back the wet paper, I saw the box beneath was old, the wood stained and worn, splintering at the edges. It was definitely an antique, but felt more ancient than old. I took a deep breath and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of dark, withered leaves, was a small, ornate mirror. It was beautiful, but in a dark way. The frame was made of silver, tarnished with age, and the glass was murky, like it hadn't reflected anything for years. Beneath it was a neatly folded slip of paper. I reached in, the leaves crunching under my fingers as I pulled out the note. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, and when I unfolded it, the words were legible but almost faded beyond recognition. The message sent a jolt of terror straight through me. Do not look into the mirror. It shows what should not be seen. I stared at the note, my mind racing. Who would send something like this? And why? It felt like a prank, but there was something too real, too authentic about it. I glanced at the mirror, still sitting innocently in the box. The rational part of me wanted to just throw it away, to pretend I'd never seen it. But there was another part, a darker part, that whispered in the back of my mind, urging me to just take one little peek. The rain outside seemed louder, more insistent, and I felt like I should hurry. Without thinking, I reached for the mirror, my fingers brushing against the cold, tarnished silver of the frame. The glass was almost black, opaque with age, but as I tilted it toward me, an image began to form. At first, I could barely make out anything. It was murky, like looking through a thick fog. But then slowly shapes began to emerge. I squinted, leaning closer. My own reflection was there, but it was faint, like an after-image burned into glass. Behind me, the room came into focus. My kitchen, the candle on the table, the rain still pounding against the windows. But something was wrong. The reflection was showing more than just me. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, shadows cast by the storm outside, but the longer I stared, the clearer the figures became. There were people, no, not people, something else, crowding behind me. Their forms were twisted, their faces gaunt and pale, with eyes that were wide and unblinking. They stood still, unnaturally still, as if frozen in time, but their eyes, they were all staring directly at me. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, maybe a dozen of them, all crowded into the small kitchen. Their clothes were tattered and old, some soaked through as if they'd been soaked by the rain, others draped in the shreds of what looked like burial shrouds. Their skin had patches of decay revealing the bone beneath. I wanted to scream, to drop the mirror and run, but I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrifying scene in the glass. I wanted to scream, to drop the mirror and run, but I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrifying scene in the glass. There was a woman closest to me, her face twisted with a grotesque expression of sorrow. Her mouth hung open as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Her hair hung in clumps, water dripping from the ends, as though she'd just crawled out of a grave. Behind her was a child, a little boy, his eyes hollow and sunken, his hands clutching a broken doll. The doll's head lolled to one side, its face cracked and missing an eye, mirroring the boy's own face, which was missing a chunk of flesh from his cheek, exposing the white bone beneath. He wasn't moving, but his eyes, they were following me, tracking me. Then there was the man, standing in the far corner, almost hidden by the shadows. He was tall, his limbs too long, his fingers like claws, the nails yellowed and cracked. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could see his mouth twisted into a sneer, revealing rotting teeth that looked sharp enough to tear flesh. As I watched, one of them, the woman, took a step closer in the reflection, but when I spun around to face her, the kitchen was empty, just as it had been moments before. The only sound was the rain and my own panicked breathing. I turned back to the mirror, and they were all still there, closer now. The woman was almost at my shoulder. Her breath, cold and reeking, seemed to brush against my neck. I could feel it, smell it, though she was physically not there. The boy had moved too, stepping forward, his hand reaching out towards me, his little fingers curling as though to put his hand in mine. Panic surged through me, a cold, suffocating wave. I stumbled forward, away from them, the mirror slipping from my hands. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, but it didn't shatter completely, just a single jagged line splitting the glass in two. I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest, and then slowly I bent down to pick it up. That's when I saw the note. It had been hidden under the leaves, folded neatly at the bottom of the box. My hands shook as I reached for it, the paper damp and cold to the touch. I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words, the letters smeared and faded but still readable. They're always there. They want you to see. Don't look away. I dropped the note, backing away from the box, from the mirror, from the nightmare that had invaded my home. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to leave, but I couldn't process what I'd seen. The mirror, cracked but not shattered, lay on the floor, the spirit still visible in its broken surface. They were even closer now, almost on top of me, reaching for me, their hands outstretched, their mouths moving silently, forming words that I couldn't hear, but I could feel deep in my bones. In a moment of cold clarity, I realized this wasn't just a reflection of what was there. The mirror wasn't showing something from the past or some distorted version of reality. It was showing the present. These spirits, these entities, they were here, in the room with me. I just couldn't see them without the mirror. But they could see me. The rain outside suddenly seemed like a distant memory, drowned out by the deafening silence that filled the room. I was gasping. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at the mirror, at the horrors it was revealing. I knew the cursed mirror had brought something into my home, some new level of sight that I didn't want. But I also knew I couldn't get rid of the mirror. Not now. It was the only thing that let me see them. The only thing that gave me a chance to see what was really there, to protect myself, if there was even a way to do that. I became aware again of the pouring rain outside, the sound that echoed through the empty house, a house that was no longer mine alone. I stared at the mirror, at the cracked glass that let me see the horrors within my home. Somehow, I knew this was only the beginning of my nightmare. Whether they were attached to the apartment or to me, they were here now, and I could see them. I rented the cabin because I needed a break, something far from the city where I could clear my head and just breathe. The listing described it as a secluded retreat in the woods, perfect for solitude and reflection. The photos showed a quaint single-story cabin with a wraparound porch nestled in the trees. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the place was surrounded by dense forest. When I arrived, the sun was already setting. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. The cabin itself was as charming as the pictures had promised, Wooden beams, large windows, and a stone fireplace for warmth on cold nights. But there was something else, too. Something that the pictures hadn't shown. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. After unloading my car and settling in, I decided to explore the surrounding woods before it got too dark. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out, following a narrow path that wound deeper into the trees. The further I walked, the thicker the forest became, the trees pressing in from all sides. The air was still, unnervingly so, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I don't know how long I wandered before I noticed it, the strange feeling of being watched. I'd been alone all day, but suddenly I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if someone were tracking me. I stopped, listening intently, but there was nothing, just silence. Yet the feeling persisted, prickling at the back of my neck, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. I turned around, intending to head back to the cabin, but the path was gone. I should have been able to see it, even in the dim light, but all I saw were trees, endless, towering trees. My heart began to pound in my chest, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I told myself to stay calm, that I couldn't be far from the cabin, but the gnawing sense of dread was growing stronger with every passing second. As I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to find the path again, the beam caught something in the distance. A figure standing between the trees. It was only for a split second, but I saw it clearly. A tall, shadowy shape, motionless, watching me. I froze, my breath hitching as fear took hold. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it, and now suddenly it was just there. I swept the flashlight back, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the trees. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It had to have been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I wasn't alone in these woods. I started walking faster, tripping over roots and rocks as I pushed through the undergrowth. The oppressive silence was broken only by the crunch of leaves under my feet and my own breathing. The cabin had to be close. I couldn't have wandered far, but no matter how fast I moved, the trees seemed to close in tighter around me, the darkness thickening with every step. And then, just ahead, I saw it again. The figure, closer this time, only a few yards away. It was human-like, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes, they were black, empty voids that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, pulling me in, freezing me in place. I couldn't move, couldn't even scream. All I could do was stare as it slowly, impossibly started to glide toward me. It didn't walk, it hovered, its feet never touching the ground, as if it wasn't bound by the same rules of reality that I was. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything but stand there, but my body wouldn't listen. I was paralyzed with fear, caught in the gaze of something that shouldn't exist. Just as it was about to reach me, I finally broke free from whatever spell it had cast. I turned and ran, not caring about the path, not caring about anything except getting away. Branches whipped at my face, the forest floor uneven and treacherous beneath my feet, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran, driven by a primal terror that I'd never felt before. Somehow, well after dark, I burst through the trees and into the clearing where the cabin stood, my chest heaving, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I stumbled up the porch steps, practically throwing myself against the door in my desperation to get inside. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally shoving the door open and slamming it behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door as if that could keep whatever was out there from coming in. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. Everything was silent, but the fear that gripped me wouldn't let go. And then I heard it. a sound that made my heart stop, a soft, almost imperceptible creak coming from the hallway behind me. I turned and saw something that nearly made me collapse with terror. At the end of the hallway, the door to the bedroom, the one I'd left wide open, was now shut. But it wasn't the door itself that terrified me. It was the shadow underneath it, the long, thin shadow of something standing on the other side. Something that was now inside the cabin with me. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to get out, to run, but where could I go? I was trapped alone in the middle of nowhere with something that had followed me from the woods. I could feel its presence, could almost hear the quiet, steady breathing of whatever was behind that door. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the door, not daring to blink. I reached for my phone, but my hands were trembling so badly that I dropped it, the clatter echoing through the silent cabin. I reached to pick it up, then backed away, moving toward the front door, praying that whatever was behind that door wouldn't come any closer. But then the creaking started again, this time from the bedroom door itself. It was opening, slowly, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was watch in horror as the door swung open completely. The shadow moved then, stepping out from the doorway, taking shape in the dim light. It was the same figure I'd seen in the woods, but now, up close, it was worse, so much worse. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its head was too long, its eyes too wide, too black, reflecting nothing, and its mouth was a gaping hole of emptiness. I turned and ran, wrenching the front door open and sprinting out into the night, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The forest swallowed me again, but I didn't care. I would rather take my chances out there than stay in that cabin with whatever that thing was. I managed to reach my car and peeled out, terrified it would follow me as I tore through the dirt driveway and out onto the one-lane road through the trees. I never went back to that cabin. I don't even know if it's still there, or if anyone else has rented it ever since. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget those eyes. Those empty, soulless eyes. I never believed in the paranormal until that night. But there was no other explanation. All I know for sure is that I came face to face with something evil that night. When I got the call, I almost turned it down. It was late, much later than any babysitting job I'd taken before. But the woman on the other end of the line had sounded desperate, practically begging for someone to watch her daughter for just a few hours. I hesitated, but the promise of double pay because of the short notice sealed the deal for me. I needed the money for college, and how bad could it be? A quiet evening in a big house while the kiddos slept? Easy. The house was tucked away at the end of a long, narrow road, surrounded by tall trees that blocked out the moonlight. As my car crunched up the gravel driveway, I looked up at the dark house, its windows reflecting nothing but blackness. There were no lights on inside except for a faint glow in one of the downstairs rooms. I made my way carefully through the darkness, reaching the front door, which opened before I could knock. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. She was tall and thin, her hair pulled back into a tight bun that gave her face a pinched, almost severe look. "Thank you so much for coming," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We had no one else to call." "No problem," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "I'm Camilla," the woman said, stepping aside to let me in. "Our daughter Ellie is already asleep upstairs. You shouldn't have any trouble. We'll be back after midnight." As I entered the house, I noticed how cold it was, and there was a faint musty smell, like the house had been closed up for a long time. The hallway was lined with portraits, their eyes following me as I moved deeper into the house. Camilla led me to the living room, where an ancient-looking grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner. "Help yourself to anything in the kitchen," she said, already heading for the door. "But please, don't go into the basement. It's unfinished." I nodded, but the mention of the basement made me wonder. I watched Camilla leave, the door closing behind her with a heavy thud that echoed through the silent house. I wandered through the house, trying to get comfortable, but it made me feel uneasy. I found the kitchen, but the thought of eating anything here made my stomach turn. The house was too still, too quiet. The only sound was the relentless ticking of that grandfather clock, each tick louder than the last. I checked on Ellie, finding her curled up in bed, sound asleep. The little girl was clutching a stuffed rabbit, her small chest rising and falling with steady breaths. I was relieved she was sleeping quietly. I went back to the living room, settled on the couch, trying to focus on watching videos on my phone, but my mind refused to focus. The ticking of the clock was loud, annoyingly so, echoing through my skull. I glanced at the time. It was only 9:30. I still had hours to go. Suddenly, there was a noise from upstairs, a soft thump, like something had fallen. I froze, my heart racing. I waited, listening, but there was nothing more, just the ticking of the clock. I told myself it was nothing, just a toy falling off a shelf or from the bed, but I felt like I had to be sure. I forced myself to get up and check, tiptoeing up the stairs, my hand gripping the banister tightly as I climbed. The hallway upstairs felt darker than I remembered. When I reached Ellie's room, I pushed the door open slowly, peering inside. Ellie was still in bed, but her stuffed rabbit was on the floor, lying in the center of the room. I hesitated, staring at the rabbit. It must have fallen off the bed, I told myself, but I remembered the rabbit had been tucked under her arm when I'd checked on her earlier. I quietly crossed the room, picked up the toy, and tucked it back into Ellie's arms. The girl didn't stir. I turned to leave and heard it. A soft whisper, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. It came from behind me, from the direction of the closet. Spinning around, I scanned the room, trying to see into the shadows. It was silent. I waited, frozen, listening, but the whispering had stopped. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I hurried out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me. Back in the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about that whisper, and the ticking of the clock seemed louder than ever. I sat facing the stairs, expecting to see something, anything, coming down them, and then I heard it again. More whispers. This time it was louder, clear, coming from the basement. Camilla had said not to go into the basement, but the whispering turned into something different. It was faint, muffled, but it sounded like crying, a child crying. I couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, I walked toward the basement door, a sense of overwhelming dread coming over me. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I remember thinking I could leave now, just walk away, call Camilla from outside and tell her something was wrong. But as the crying grew louder, more desperate, I felt compelled to open the door. The basement was pitch black, the air even colder than the rest of the house. I fumbled for the light switch, flicking on, a small bulb hanging at the bottom of the stairs, casting a weak, sickly glow. As I climbed down the stairs, the crying grew louder, echoing off the concrete walls. But there was something else, too. More whispering, just beneath the crying, like a voice speaking directly into my mind. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. In the middle of the basement, illuminated by that dim light, stood a small figure. Ellie. But something was wrong. Ellie's face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, standing perfectly still facing a corner. Her mouth was moving, but the whispers were incomprehensible, like she was speaking to herself. Ellie? The girl didn't respond. She just kept whispering, her eyes fixed on something in the corner of that room. I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. There in the shadows stood another figure, tall, its face obscured by darkness. The air around it seemed to vibrate with evil, the very presence of it sending waves of terror through my body. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form, something ancient and evil watching Ellie with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed watching Ellie and the horror that stood before me. I thought dark, twisted thoughts that weren't my own, commanding me to leave the child, to run, and to never look back. But then suddenly, the figure moved. It reached out a hand, long and skeletal, toward Ellie. The girl didn't flinch as the hand reached for her. With a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, the figure hissed inside my head, "You shouldn't be here." The words snapped me out of my paralysis. I lunged forward, grabbing Ellie and pulling her away from that corner. She screamed, a high-pitched wail that echoed in my ears, making the figure dissolve into the shadows. Without thinking, I bolted up the stairs with Ellie clinging tightly to me. I burst out of the basement, slamming the door behind me, and ran for the front door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking uncontrollably, but finally the door swung open, and I stumbled out into the night. I didn't stop running until I threw open the car door and shoved Ellie inside, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I scrambled into the driver's seat, my fingers fumbling with the keys. When the engine roared to life, I sped down the driveway, gravel flying up behind us. When I finally recognized the roads near my house, I pulled over, my body trembling uncontrollably, my mind trying to understand what had just happened. Ellie was silent in the back seat, her eyes wide and staring straight ahead. I reached out to comfort her, to be sure she was okay. But the moment my hand brushed her skin, the little girl turned to me, her eyes black as night, and whispered in the same voice, "You shouldn't be here." The morgue was colder than I expected, the air thick with the metallic scent of formaldehyde and something else, something rotten. I had been working the night shift for a week now, and while I'd gotten used to the chill and the quiet, tonight felt different. There was an unease that seemed to seep into my bones, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck that just wouldn't go away. The morgue itself was old, with walls lined with metal drawers, each housing the still, silent bodies of those who had passed through. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the room. It was a space where life seemed to have no place, where the dead reigned in their cold silence. I had just finished logging the details of a new arrival, a man in his late 50s found dead in his home with no apparent cause. The autopsy was scheduled for the morning, but as I slid his body into one of the metal drawers, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His face, pale and serene, seemed to watch me, even as I closed the door. That's when I noticed the tattoo. It was a ram's head skull with long black eyes, dark and prominent on his chest. The tattoo looked fresh, like it was alive on his very dead flesh. I turned away, trying to ignore how the tattoo made me uncomfortable, and slid the long drawer with his outstretched body inside the cold storage locker. The loud slam as it closed amplified the silence of the morgue. I never minded the stillness, but tonight it felt like it was pressing in on me. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigeration units, a low, droning noise that seemed to echo in the emptiness. I went back to my desk, trying to focus on my paperwork, but my mind kept drifting back to that body in the drawer, that tattoo with its long black eyes. Absent-mindedly, I doodled the image on my notes, the ram's head now staring at me from the paper. I looked at it, looking at me, and covered the drawing. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the shuffle of footsteps. I froze, listening, but the noise had already faded back into the silence. I glanced around the room, but everything was as it should be. The doors were closed, the light steady, the rows of drawers undisturbed. But that feeling of being watched had intensified, despite covering the image I'd drawn. and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more and more frequently. Each time, I saw nothing, but the feeling stayed with me. I told myself I was letting the work get to me, and the late hour. The isolation was just playing tricks on my mind. But when the sound came again, this time louder, clearer, a distinct shuffle, I knew I wasn't alone. I turned my head towards the source of the noise, my eyes scanning the room with a growing dread. At first, I saw nothing. The room was empty, as it always was. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the drawers, the one I had just placed the man's body in, was slightly open. It was impossible. I had closed it myself. I'd heard the click as it latched shut. But there it was, open just a crack, a sliver of darkness peering out from within. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I had to go and shut it, and to reassure myself that nothing was wrong. But what I really wanted to do was get out of there, to leave this place and never look back. I forced myself to approach the drawer, stepping slowly as I crossed the room. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. My imagination raced with all the things that could be behind that door, but I couldn't leave it, couldn't let it stay open and unanswered. With a deep breath, I pulled the drawer open. Of course, the body was still there, lying as I had left it, the man's face pale and peaceful. But something was different. His hands, which I had placed at his sides, were now crossed over his chest, his fingers covering the tattoo. His mouth, which had been slightly open, was now closed, his lips pressed together in a thin, grim line. And his eyes were wide open, staring straight up at me as I leaned over the drawer. The man's eyes had been closed, I was sure of it. I stumbled back as the drawer slammed shut on its own, the force rattling the metal frame. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was impossible. None of this made sense. I was alone here, and the body was dead. It couldn't have moved on its own. I backed away, my eyes never leaving that drawer, as if expecting it to open again at any moment. The silence of the morgue pressed in around me, and then I heard the sound again, like the dragging of feet across the tiled floor. The hair on my arms stood on end, and I whipped around, searching for the source, but saw nothing. The dragging sound continued, slow and deliberate, circling me, growing louder with each passing second. My mind raced, panic clawing at the edges of my sanity, and then it stopped. Dead silence fell over the room, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I strained to listen, to catch any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just that suffocating silence. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, to get as far away from this room as possible. But as I took a step towards the door, a voice whispered from behind me, soft and raspy, like dead leaves in the wind, "You asked for it." I froze. I felt a searing pain on my chest. The voice was so close, right behind me, as if someone was leaning in to speak directly into my ear. I could feel the cold breath against my neck, the hairs on my skin standing on end. Slowly I turned, my heart in my throat. The room was empty, the drawers all closed, but I could feel that burning on my chest intensifying, like a hot poker was searing my skin. There was something unseen, something evil, touching me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted for the door, my feet slipping on the cold tiles as I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air biting into my skin. I pulled at my scrubs and felt the burn on my chest. The blistered skin was turning black like ink, the shape of the ram's head becoming clear, just like the man's tattoo. I didn't go back to that morgue after that. I quit, leaving without explanation, too terrified to even step foot near that place again. When I asked about the tattooed man, they sounded confused. There were no tattoos on any of the morgue's cadavers. She was used to creaky floors, dusty corners, and the occasional odd trinkets left behind by clients, but nothing prepared her for this particular house on the edge of town. It was a grand old Victorian, its paint chipped and faded, surrounded by an overgrown garden that had long since forgotten the touch of human hands. The place was in disrepair, and it was going to be a big job, but the money offered was good, too good to pass up. The key was under the doormat, just as the client had said in her email. Emily paused for a moment, looking around for any sign of life, but the neighborhood was quiet. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and the smell of dust and mildew greeted her like a thick, suffocating blanket. Inside, the house was dark, even though it was the middle of the day. Heavy drapes covered every window, blocking out the sunlight. Emily's first task was clear. She needed to let in some light, but as she reached for the first drape, a voice, barely more than a whisper, brushed against her ear. "Don't." Emily froze. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing there behind her, but the hallway was empty. Just the sound of her own breathing filled the silence. She shook it off, convincing herself it was just her imagination in this old house. Houses this old had a way of playing tricks on people. She pulled back the drape, flooding the room with light, and for a moment everything seemed normal. Dust particles floated lazily in the air, illuminated by the sun's rays. She exhaled a shaky breath and got to work. As she moved through the house, the feeling of unease grew stronger. She couldn't shake the sensation that someone was there. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of fabric seemed amplified, as if someone was deliberately making their presence known. But every time she turned around, she was met with nothing but emptiness. In the kitchen, she found an old photograph pinned to the fridge with yellowing tape. The people in them, an older couple and a young boy, stared out with hollow eyes, their faces blurred and smudged as if someone had tried to erase their features. A shiver ran down her spine as she quickly turned away from the disturbing picture. In the upstairs hallway, she came across a door that was slightly open, leading to a bedroom, its bed neatly made, though everything else in the room was covered in a thick layer of dust. On the nightstand, a small porcelain doll sat propped up against the wall, its cracked face turned toward the door. The room didn't feel right, even worse than the rest of the house. Emily felt the drop in temperature as soon as she stepped into the room. As she reached out to dust the nightstand, the door behind her slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. She gasped and turned around, her heart pounding. The door was shut tight, the handle refusing to turn when she tried to open it. With panic surging through her, she began pounding on the door, shouting for help. But the only answer she received was a soft, sinister giggle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear as she searched the room for any other exit. That's when she noticed it. The doll had moved. It was no longer leaning against the wall, but was now sitting upright, its cracked face turned directly toward her. Its empty eyes seemed to glisten with mischief. As she backed away, she felt the icy touch of fingers brush against the back of her neck. She spun around, but there was no one there. Just the cold, empty room and that damn doll watching her with its lifeless eyes. A whisper slithered through the air, soft yet unmistakable. "Let's play." Terror gripped her as she realized she wasn't alone. There was something in here, something she couldn't see that was toying with her. She had to get out, she had to escape, but the door was locked. She tried the windows, but they were painted shut. Desperation clawed at her as she heard giggling all around her. She covered her ears and sank to the floor. Seconds turned into minutes with the relentless laughter from every direction. She closed her eyes tightly and thought of her own kids, saw their faces in her mind, and wondered if she would ever see them again. As soon as those thoughts entered her mind, the whispered laughter stopped. The room fell silent, but she still didn't feel like she was alone. Something was there in that room with her. In that instant, the doorknob turned, and with a loud click, the heavy wooden door slowly creaked open. She bolted from the room, nearly tripping over her own feet as she ran down the stairs and out of the house. She didn't stop running until she was outside beside her car. When she finally looked back, the house stood as it had before, silent and still. But she knew something was watching her from behind those dark windows, something that had let her leave this time. Reaching into her hoodie for her keys, she felt something else in the pocket. With trembling hands, she pulled the doll from the nightstand out of her pocket, its dead eyes staring at her. Emily screamed and threw it towards the house, driving away as quickly as possible. She never returned to that house for her supplies. When she tried to contact the client, the email bounced back as undeliverable. It was as if they'd never existed. And maybe they didn't. Mike had been on the road for hours. The miles blurred together as the hum of his semi-truck filled the cab, its rhythmic drone lulling him into a state of tired monotony. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just after midnight. The stretch of highway he was on was deserted, a winding ribbon of asphalt that cut through a vast expanse of nothingness. He hadn't seen another car for miles. He'd driven this route many times before, hauling goods across the state, but tonight felt different. There was no moon tonight, and he couldn't even see the stars. The headlights barely cut through the dark, illuminating only the few feet of road ahead before being swallowed up by the night. Mike adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, trying to shake off the sleepiness he was feeling. The coffee he'd chugged at the last rest stop was wearing off, leaving him with that uncontrollable, jittery exhaustion. He thought about pulling over, but something kept him going, a feeling that if he stopped, something might catch up with him. As he drove, a soft crackling sound filled the cab. It was the CB radio, which had been silent for hours. The crackling grew louder, then faded, then came back again. Mike frowned and reached for the dial, thinking it was just picking up interference. But before he could turn it off, a woman's voice came through, distorted and distant. "Breaker, breaker, anyone out there?" The voice was hollow, with an eerie, echoey quality, as if it were coming from a long way off. Mike wondered if he should pick up the receiver. He hadn't heard anyone on the CB all night, and something about the voice made him uncomfortable. "This is Big Mike," he responded, trying to keep his tone steady. "Who's calling?" There was a long pause, just the sound of static hissing through the speaker. Then the voice returned, quieter this time, almost a whisper. "Big Mike, you're not alone." Mike's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at the passenger seat and then into the empty sleeper behind him, half expecting to see someone or something sitting there. But the cab was empty. He forced a laugh, trying to shake off the rising fear. "Yeah, whatever," he muttered, but the joke fell flat even to his own ears. The voice didn't respond. The static died down, leaving only the low hum of the engine and the faint whistle of wind against the windows. Mike tried to focus on the road again, but the feeling that something was off gnawed at him. A few miles later, the radio crackled again, and the same voice broke through, louder this time, almost frantic. "Mike, you need to stop." Mike's hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles turning white. He checked his mirrors again, but the highway behind him was just as empty as before. The only thing he could see was the darkness. "Who is this?" he demanded, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. The reply was immediate, as if the voice had been waiting for him to ask. "Mike, look in the mirror." Against his better judgment, Mike's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. At first he saw nothing, just the dim outline of the empty road. But as he stared, something moved at the edge of the darkness. It was faint, like a flicker, like a shadow within a shadow. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was there, keeping pace with the truck, matching its speed. Panic surged through him, and he pressed down on the accelerator, the truck's engine roaring as it picked up speed. But the faster he went, the closer the shadows seemed to get, growing larger in the mirror, until it filled the entire frame. Suddenly the cab grew cold, as if all the warmth had been sucked out. Mike could see his breath as he tried to ignore the feeling of icy fingers brushing against the back of his neck. He wanted to pull over, to stop and run, but his hands seemed fused to the wheel, his foot glued to the pedal. "Stop the truck, Mike," the voice on the radio urged, now a low growl, "or it will stop you." The words sent a jolt of fear through him, but he couldn't stop. Not here, not now. He had to keep going, had to outrun whatever this was that was following him. The shadow in the mirror grew closer, almost touching the back of the truck now, its form still indistinct but undeniably menacing. Without warning, the truck jerked violently to the side, as if something had grabbed hold of the back and yanked it. Mike fought to control the wheel, his heart hammering in his chest. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't words that came through. It was a low, guttural laugh, the kind that sent chills down to his bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The radio went silent, the static fading into nothingness. The temperature in the cab returned to normal, and the road stretched out before him, empty and still, just as it had been. Mike struggled to breathe as he slowed the truck to a crawl. His hands were trembling, sweat dripping from his palms. He had to get off this road, had to find somewhere safe to stop. As he pulled off at the next exit, he kept looking in the mirror, half expecting the shadow to reappear, to lunge out of the darkness and drag him back. But the mirror showed only the empty road, nothing more. He found a truck stop and parked, cutting the engine and sitting in silence for a long time, trying to convince himself it had all been in his head. But when he finally dared to check the mirror one last time, he saw it, etched into the fogged-up glass, faint but unmistakable, 2 words scrawled by an unseen hand: "Next time." Mike didn't sleep that night, and he never took that route again. The operating room was the one place where I could shut out the world. Here I controlled every variable, every outcome as much as humanly possible. Everything was precision. The tools, the lights, the movements of my hands. The team followed my lead. We worked like a machine. Today was a routine heart bypass, a procedure I had performed so many times that my hands worked almost automatically. The patient, Mr. Caldwell, was sedated, his chest open before me, the beating heart visible beneath the stark white lights. "Scalpel," I said, extending my hand, the familiar weight of the tool pressed into my palm. Everything was going as planned. And then I saw him. He stood at the far corner of the room, barely noticeable at first, a tall man dressed in a black suit that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of the OR. A fedora sat low on his head, casting his face in shadow. He wasn't part of the team. I knew every nurse, every anesthesiologist in the room, and no one else had noticed him. "Everything all right, doctor?" the scrub nurse asked, her voice cutting through my sudden unease. I glanced back at my team. No one else was looking in the direction of that man. No one even flinched. It was as if he wasn't there. "I'm fine," I lied, turning back to the patient. I told myself it was stress, long hours, lack of sleep. Hallucinations weren't uncommon under those types of circumstances. But as I refocused on the surgery, I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. The figure hadn't moved, but he was still watching. I could feel it, his gaze boring into me as I worked. My fingers trembled slightly, a tremor I had never experienced in the OR before. I swallowed, forcing myself to focus. Caldwell's heart, now exposed and fragile, pumped steadily under the bright lights. I was in control. But the hallucination of the man in black didn't go away. As I moved to graft the bypass, I saw him take a step closer. His shoes made no sound on the sterile floor. He wasn't wearing a mask, gloves, nothing to indicate he belonged here. My heart rate spiked, and I hesitated for just a moment, scalpel poised above Mr. Caldwell's open chest. "Doctor?" The nurse's voice pulled me back. "Are we continuing?" I blinked, refocusing. "Yes, sorry." I went back to work, but my movements felt mechanical. Each second the man grew nearer, I felt my composure slipping away. Why was I seeing this so vividly? Who was this guy? When he was so close to the operating table that the shadow of his fedora loomed over Mr. Caldwell, I opened my mouth to say something, to call for help, but the words died in my throat. No one else saw him. No one even looked in his direction. The man's hand, pale against the dark suit, reached out toward Caldwell. I froze mid-incision as the hand hovered over the patient's face. His fingers were unnaturally long, bony, with skin that looked almost translucent under the bright surgical lights. I watched in silent horror as the man gently, almost tenderly, placed his hand over Mr. Caldwell's eyes. In that instant, the heart monitor let out a sharp, continuous tone, the flat line. My patient was coding. I couldn't move. My eyes were glued to the man as the team scrambled all around me, trying to revive Caldwell. The defibrillator whined to life, and they applied the paddles, but it was useless. I could see Caldwell's body convulsing with each shock, but all I could focus on was the man in black. He stood over my patient, his hand still covering Caldwell's eyes as though sealing him off from the living world. The defibrillator fired again, but Caldwell's heart didn't respond. His body fell limp on the table, the life draining out of him. And then, just as silently as he had appeared, the man in black withdrew his hand, tipping his fedora as though bidding farewell to something unseen. He turned slowly and walked toward the corner of the room, disappearing into the shadows as though he had never been there at all. "Time of death, 4:52, someone announced. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the empty space where the man had been. "Doctor, are you okay?" The nurse's voice sounded far away, like he was speaking through a thick fog. I nodded mechanically, though I couldn't feel my own body. My mind was still trapped in that moment, the moment when the man in black had taken Caldwell's life. I glanced down at the patient. His face was pale, his eyes closed, peaceful in death. But all I could see was the image of that hand covering them, sealing his fate. I never told anyone what I saw that day. How could I? Who would believe me? But now, every time I step into that operating room, I remember how it felt to be in that cold, oppressive presence. I dread the thought of seeing him again in my operating room. That man, watching and waiting, and I know someday he will come for me. The dim glow of the computer screen bathed Alex in its eerie light as he sat hunched over his gaming setup. His room, cluttered with snack wrappers and empty soda cans, was quiet except for the steady clacking of his keyboard and the soft murmur of his live stream chat. The game he was playing, a popular horror survival game, wasn't particularly scary, but Alex knew how to create suspense. His subscribers loved his playstyle, and tonight's stream was no different. As he navigated through a dark, abandoned asylum in the game, Alex noticed an odd occurrence. A small, flickering shadow appeared in the corner of his screen. He shrugged it off, assuming it was just a glitch in the game, but the chat lit up with comments. "Did you see that shadow?" one viewer typed. "It's just a glitch," Alex responded, trying to brush it off with a growing sense of fear. But as he played, the shadow became more defined, almost as if something was moving behind him in the room. A new message in the chat said, "Look behind you." He looked over his shoulder, but the room was empty, and the door to the hallway was closed. Alex kept playing, but the shadows started to reappear in the corner of his screen more frequently. The game's asylum had a shadowy demon that moved in and out of the darkness, and Alex figured it was just the game getting into his head, nothing else. But he jumped when he heard a knock at the door. His heart raced. It was late, and he was alone in the house. He paused the game and walked cautiously to the door, opening it just a crack, but no one was there. The knocking must have been in-game. But as he sat down, the chat was blowing up with worried messages. "Alex, are you okay? Something's wrong." Suddenly, his computer screen flickered, and the image on the screen was replaced by a live feed from a camera. The camera wasn't in his room, but it was positioned somewhere close. It looked like the hallway just outside his door. The feed was grainy, but it clearly showed a shadow moving around. Alex checked his webcam feed. It was still on, and the view from his camera was perfectly normal, but he couldn't make out who was in the hallway. He fumbled with his phone, trying to call for help, but his phone was dead. The shadow in the feed was slowly making its way down the hallway. He could see it growing larger as it approached. A noise behind him made him spin around. On screen, the shadow was now directly at his door, as if the shadow from the game had somehow materialized into his reality. Alex was panicking, staring at the camera, feeling trapped in his game room, with thousands of eyes watching him fall apart. The figure in the live feed stood there, motionless, until it finally reached for the door handle. Alex could hear a scratching sound coming from outside his door. He backed away from his desk, feeling an intense sense of dread as the door handle began to turn. He grabbed a bottle from his desk and prepared to defend himself. The door creaked open, and the figure's silhouette was visible in the doorway. It was tall and thin, its features hidden in darkness. With a final burst of adrenaline, Alex ran at the door, slamming it shut. The hallway was silent. He heard no footsteps, no movement beyond the door. He quickly turned off his computer and grabbed his phone, which had miraculously come back to life. He called the police, who arrived soon after, but they found no one, and no sign of forced entry. The live feed had stopped, and his computer showed nothing out of the ordinary. Alex never figured out how the hack had happened, or who was in the hallway of his house. Even though that video went viral, it was the last live stream he ever made. I never used to get anxious working alone. Being a landscaper meant plenty of solitary time, even in secluded backyards or sprawling estates, where the only sounds were the hum of my trimmer and the rustle of trees in the wind. That changed after the Carter job. The Carter property was out in the middle of nowhere, tucked behind miles of country road, surrounded by woods. The house was huge, old, and overgrown with ivy and weeds. They wanted a full overhaul, trimming the hedges, cutting back the trees, resodding the lawn. The pay was great, and I figured it would be an easy week-long job. The first few days went smoothly. The yard was a mess, but nothing I couldn't handle. I worked alone as usual. It was peaceful, despite the isolation. But by the fourth day, something had shifted. It started small, just a feeling like I wasn't alone. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye just beyond the tree line. I shook it off as nothing more than nerves. Too much coffee or too much heat. It happens when you're working long hours. That afternoon, I was clearing out a patch of overgrown bushes near the back of the house when I heard it, a faint voice. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the trees. Out there, they creaked and groaned as the wind moved through the leaves, something sounding almost like whispers. But this was different. It was low and indistinct, but definitely there. I stood still, listening. The voice came again, clearer this time, a single word drawn out in a way that made my skin crawl. Help. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one, just the house looming behind me and the woods beyond that. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn. I hadn't seen anyone inside that house since I started working. But the voice had sounded close, too close. I swallowed, trying to shake off the fear that was crawling up my spine. Maybe someone was hiking in the woods talking to themselves. I didn't let myself dwell on it. As I moved around the property working, I kept hearing it. Faint at first, then louder, then closer. Always the same word. Help. By late afternoon, I was jumpy, constantly glancing over my shoulder, and I wasn't getting anything done. I didn't know if what I was hearing was my imagination or something more. Either way, I was completely on edge. I felt like someone was standing just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. But whenever I looked, the yard was empty, and the house loomed, silent and still. I packed up my tools early, deciding to call it a day. Maybe I'd come back tomorrow with fresh eyes, feeling less rattled. As I walked toward my truck, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. The voice was right behind me now, a whisper in my ear. Don't go. The truck was only a few yards away, but suddenly it felt miles out of reach. Slowly I turned around, heart pounding in my chest. And there, by the corner of the house, stood a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, but his body was hunched, and he was hidden in the shadow of the house. His clothes were old and dirty, hanging off him like they didn't fit. His face was gray, with eyes that seemed to shine in the fading light. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. When the wind picked up again, rustling the leaves, the man didn't shift, didn't look away. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but my throat felt blocked. Then he smiled. It was a slow, crooked smile that stretched across his face like a crack opening in the earth. He raised a hand and pointed at the house. Inside, he whispered. His lips barely moved, but I heard the sound right by my ear. It's waiting. I didn't wait to find out what that meant. My feet moved before my brain could catch up, and I sprinted for my truck. I didn't look back, not once, as I threw my tools into the back and jumped into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the driveway, my hands shaking so hard I could barely keep the wheel steady. I didn't go back the next day. I didn't even call the Carters to explain. I didn't care about the job or the money, any of it. Whatever it was, I don't know, but I was never going to go near that property again. I've pet sat for years now. Cats, dogs, birds. There's nothing I haven't handled. But one job, at the Hartley house, something happened that I still can't explain. It was supposed to be a routine job. 3 days at their place taking care of Scout, their Australian shepherd, while they were out of town. The Hartleys had a big old house just at the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but enough space for Scout to run around. I'd been there once before, and everything had gone smoothly. So when they called again, I didn't hesitate. The first day was easy. I got there around noon, let myself in with the key they'd left, and Scout jumped up to greet me, wagging his tail. We spent the afternoon playing fetch in the yard, and I took him for a long walk around the neighborhood before dinner. Nothing unusual, just the typical pet-sitting routine. The house was old but charming in that creaky, settled way, like it had seen a lot but still stood solid. The kind of place that would feel better with a fire going in winter. But that night, something felt off. I assumed it was just the isolation. It was quiet out there, and I wasn't used to being so far from the usual sounds of the city. Around 10, I went to lock up and head to bed. Scout was already dozing in his crate by the time I finished my nightly rounds, and I went upstairs to the guest bedroom, hearing the wooden floor creak as I walked. The wind had picked up, and I could hear the faint rattling of branches against the windows. But as I lay in bed, I began to hear something else, a faint tapping. It was so soft at first that I thought it was just Scout scratching, or maybe a branch hitting the siding in the wind. I tried to ignore it, but it kept going, rhythmically. It almost sounded like someone was tapping their finger against wood. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. I got up and crept down the hallway, my feet sliding along the groaning floorboards. The sound grew louder as I neared the staircase. My heart pounded as I peered over the banister, scanning the darkness below. But the house was quiet, except for that damn tapping. And then it stopped. Everything was silent now, too silent. I held my breath to listen closely. Even Scout, who normally barked at the slightest noise, hadn't stirred. I made my way downstairs, one step at a time, my hand gripping the railing like it might fall out from under me. I reached the bottom, where the living room lay bathed in the glow of the moon through the curtains. Everything seemed normal, nothing notably out of place, and the front door was still locked. But it felt like something was there that didn't belong. And that's when I saw it. On the far wall, just past the kitchen doorway, the door to the basement was open. I was sure I'd locked it earlier. I always made sure everything was secure before bed. But there it was, slightly open, a sliver of blackness gaping from below. I didn't want to investigate, but something pulled me toward it. Maybe it was the irrational thought that Scout had somehow gotten down there, though I knew he was upstairs in his crate. As I stepped closer, the tapping sound began again. Faint but unmistakable, now coming from the basement. As I gripped the knob and pulled the door open wider, the tapping stopped again. My eyes strained to see into the inky darkness below, and I instinctively reached for the light switch on the wall. But the light wouldn't come on. A cold knot twisted in my stomach, and I was about to back away when Scout's bark tore through the silence. The sudden noise made me jump, and I slammed the door shut, heart hammering in my chest. Scout was upstairs, barking frantically now, as if something had startled him. I ran up the stairs, taking two at a time, into his owner's bedroom through a shortcut via the bathroom. I found Scout standing rigid in his crate, ears perked, his gaze fixed on the door to the hallway. I let him out, but he stayed close as I tried to calm him. His growling made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. He wasn't growling at me. He was growling at something else. Then I heard it again, the tapping. But this time it wasn't from the basement. It was coming from the hallway. I backed up, my heart pounding, and Scout let out a low whine, his body trembling. Summoning all the courage I had left, I edged toward the door, hoping there was some rational explanation for what we were hearing. But as I reached for the doorknob, the tapping stopped. Dead silence filled the air. Then, slowly, I heard a soft, raspy voice whisper from the other side of the door, "Let me in." I staggered back, and Scout started growling like crazy. The door handle rattled like someone was trying to open it, and that voice, even closer now, whispered again, more insistent, "Let me in." I grabbed Scout's leash, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and bolted through the bathroom out to the far end of the hallway and down the stairs. I didn't look back. I didn't care if I left anything behind. All I knew was that I had to get out of that house. The door slammed behind me as I ran to my car with Scout. I drove straight home with him, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I never went back to the Hartleys' house. They picked Scout up from me when they got back from their trip, and I was done with them. I didn't care about the money, and I explained to them that I'd heard some strange noises in the house, to which Mrs. Hartley shot me a strange look, but said nothing. I did hear the house went up for sale a few months later, so maybe they had their own experiences. Some things are better left unknown. If you like these stories, this is the place for you. I cover scary stories about ghosts, cryptids, paranormal events, and disturbing, creepy human encounters. My Etsy store is open if you'd like to support me there. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.